The night it happened, everything in me went quiet. The spoon was still on the table, the soup still steaming, but my heart felt like it had stopped beating for a moment. His hand had just struck the face that once kissed his forehead goodnight. I stood there, not because I was strong, but because the shock was heavier than my tears. I watched his eyes harden as he told me to wipe my face, like my pain was nothing but a stain on his plans. He didn't flinch, not once. That was when I knew this story wouldn't end in silence. Something inside me whispered that the world would hear what he thought no one ever would. Thank you so much for watching and for taking this time to be here with me. It means more than you know. And before I continue, please tell me in the comments where you are watching from. My name is Beatrice, and I live in Montana, a quiet place where the mornings are gentle and the nights carry a kind of silence that can hold every memory. For most of my life, I believed that if you poured your love into a home, it would always keep you warm. I raised him with that belief stitched into every corner of my heart. I gave him everything I could, even when there was little left for myself. I worked long hours, came home tired, cooked, cleaned, and smiled because I thought that was what love was supposed to look like. I thought that one day, when he was older and life had its way of toughening him, he would look back and see how hard I tried to keep everything together. I never imagined I would stand in that same kitchen, in the house I built with my hands and prayers, and feel like a stranger in my own home. The bruise on my face that night wasn't just skin deep. It was like a mirror cracking right in front of me. Every sacrifice I had ever made, every night I had stayed awake waiting for him to come home safe when he was younger, every plate I had set with care, suddenly felt like it had been invisible all along. And the way he looked at me that night, with no trace of shame, no flicker of softness, told me that something inside him had changed long before that moment. I spent that night sitting in the corner of my room, my hand resting gently against the side of my face, not to ease the pain, but to hold the weight of what had just happened. I stared at the wall and kept hearing his voice, not the words exactly, but the tone. Cold, commanding, as if my existence was just another piece of furniture in the house, meant to be quiet and useful. I thought about how love can turn into something unrecognizable when respect disappears. I thought about how I had spent so much of my life making sure he never went without. And now here I was, sitting in the dark, holding the sting of his hand like it was some kind of proof that my love had been misplaced. That night felt like a long road that had no end, and as the hours slowly passed, I sat alone in that small room and thought about everything that had brought me to this moment. I thought about the years when life was hard, but still felt full of purpose. I remembered the nights when I would work until my hands were sore just so he could have what I never did. I would walk through the cold wind to catch the early bus, come home with aching legs, and still find the strength to put a warm meal on the table, because in my heart I believed that was what a mother's love should look like. Every choice I made was shaped around the idea that if I gave enough, he would understand the weight of my sacrifices and carry it with pride, not use it against me. When he was younger, I used to watch him run through the yard with a smile that could light up the dullest evening. I would sit on the steps and tell myself that no matter how hard the world became, I would be his safe place. And I kept that promise, even when the world didn't make it easy for me. I held on to it when the bills piled high, when food was scarce, when I had to choose between my own needs and his comfort. I kept believing that love was stronger than hardship, that kindness raised inside a home would always stay rooted. I see now that love can grow strong roots, but if it's not nurtured on both sides, it can also be trampled. Over time, I noticed little things changing in the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, and the way he started to look down at me like I was no longer the woman who had once been his entire world. I brushed those moments aside because I thought it was just life shaping him differently, that the man he was becoming still had the boy inside who loved me. I see now how wrong I was to keep giving without asking to be seen. I gave too much room for his silence, and that silence became a wall between us. The respect I thought was unshakable slowly crumbled, and I didn't even see it until it was too late. That night when he raised his hand, it wasn't just a moment of cruelty. It was the final crack in something I had spent my whole life building. I sat there remembering how I had once whispered prayers over him while he slept, how I had kissed his forehead before long work shifts, how I believed that my love would always be enough. I never thought I would be standing in my kitchen with a bruise on my face, left there by the person I had carried through storms. And the worst part wasn't the pain itself. It was how easy it was for him to do it. How natural it seemed in that moment, like my dignity could be tossed aside as if it had no weight at all. I told myself that night that this pain would not be the last chapter of my story. I had lived through many storms, but this one wasn't going to drown me. I felt something stir deep inside me, a quiet kind of strength that didn't scream or rush. It simply waited, steady and clear. For the first time in a long while, I didn't think about how to make him happy. I thought about how to make myself safe. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who worked hard, who stood tall when life knocked her down, and I realized she was still here, waiting for me to return to her. I was no longer the woman who would bow her head and stay quiet. I had lived too much life to be broken by one moment, no matter how painful it was. As the sun slowly began to rise, the air in the house felt colder than it had the night before. Not because of the weather, but because something in me had changed. I sat on the edge of my bed watching the light slip through the curtains, and every breath I took reminded me that the woman who had sat silently with pain the night before was no longer the same. The bruise on my face was tender, but the ache in my heart was far heavier, like a weight pressing down on everything I had once believed about love, respect, and family. I traced the line of my cheek with my fingertips, not to feel the hurt, but to remind myself that it was real. It happened. It wasn't a bad dream that I could shake off when morning came. It was my reality now, and I had to face it with eyes wide open. When I stepped out of the room, the sound of the floor creaking beneath my feet felt louder than usual, almost as if the house itself was watching me. I walked into the kitchen where everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. The pot was still sitting on the stove, the soup now cold and untouched, and for a moment I stared at it as if it held all the answers I needed. I thought about how many times I had stood in that same kitchen, waiting to hear his footsteps, cooking meals with love and care, believing that this was what made a home whole. But now that same place felt like a stage where my pain had been put on display. He walked in with no sign of regret on his face, not even a glance that carried the weight of what he had done. His voice was steady, sharp, almost rehearsed, as he said those words that I will never forget. He told me to cover the bruise, to smile when his wife's guests arrived, and to act like nothing had happened. I stood there, quiet, listening to every word, and in that silence something inside me hardened like stone. I realized in that moment that the respect I once thought would always live in his heart was gone, and what remained was control dressed up as family duty. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time, I saw a stranger. Not the boy I had raised, not the man I had hoped would treat me with kindness, but someone I didn't recognize. His eyes were cold, his words calculated, and the way he spoke to me wasn't out of love. It was out of a need to keep me small and quiet. And as I stood there, something shifted in me. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and firm, like the way the ground feels before a storm breaks. I nodded my head, not because I agreed, but because I knew this was the last time I was going to let him tell me how to exist in my own home. In that single breath, I decided that my silence would no longer belong to him. I decided that I was done shrinking to fit into the corners he pushed me into. I spent years pouring my love into him, and in one moment, he had shown me how little he valued it. But I wasn't going to waste another second begging to be seen. I walked away from that kitchen with my hand resting lightly against the side of my face, not to hide the bruise, but to remind myself that this mark would not define me. It would be the reminder of the moment I stopped allowing anyone to turn my love into something weak. I felt the air shift as I closed the door behind me, and it was as if the house, once heavy with silence, now carried the echo of a promise only I could hear. This was not the end of me. This was the beginning of a choice I should have made a long time ago. The rest of that morning felt like walking through water. Everything around me moved, but I felt distant from it, like I was standing in the middle of my own life and watching it from the outside. I stood in front of the mirror and stared at the bruise that now carried the shape of that moment. It wasn't just a mark on my skin, it was a reminder of how far things had fallen, of how the love I once trusted had turned into something cold and sharp. I watched my reflection closely, the tired lines beneath my eyes, the faint trembling at the corners of my mouth, and for a long time I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. She wasn't weak, but she was tired of being quiet. She wasn't broken, but she was done pretending that nothing was wrong. I opened the small drawer in front of me and reached for the little jar of cream I used to keep for light bruises or aching joints. My hand moved slowly, not because of the pain, but because I felt like I was painting over a wound that carried years of unspoken things. As I brushed the cream across my face, I remembered how many times I had covered up my own exhaustion, how many times I had kept quiet to keep the peace, how many times I told myself that love required patience, even when that patience hurt. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't covering it to make the world feel comfortable. I was covering it to protect my peace long enough to make my next move. I walked through the house with steady steps, not because my heart wasn't heavy, but because I was no longer stumbling inside it. Every corner of that house carried memories of who I used to be. I could almost hear the laughter that used to fill those rooms, the smell of dinners made with care, the warmth that lived in the walls back when respect still had a home here. Now, that warmth felt like a ghost walking beside me. I passed the table where I once sat waiting for him to come home safe, the hallway where I used to listen for his footsteps, and the kitchen that had held both love and pain. The truth was clear now, sharper than it had ever been. What I had built with love, he had chipped away at piece by piece, until I was standing in a house that looked like mine but didn't feel like it anymore. I realized that the bruise on my face would heal faster than the wound in my heart, but that wound would not keep me still. I had been quiet for too long, turning my pain into silence, as if silence could make it disappear. But this time, I wasn't going to let it fade into another memory. This time, I was going to make sure my silence carried weight. I stood near the window and let the sunlight touch my face. It didn't warm me the way it used to, but it reminded me that the world outside this house was still waiting for me. I was not trapped. I was not powerless. I still had my voice, and even if I hadn't used it in a long time, it was still mine. As I stood there, I could feel a calm kind of strength settling in me, the kind that doesn't rush, the kind that waits for the right moment. And deep inside, I knew that moment was closer than he could ever imagine. I wasn't going to scream or fight the way he expected me to. I was going to let my silence move in ways he couldn't control. I had spent a lifetime building, and I wasn't going to let one cruel moment decide how the rest of my story would be written. I stood by that window a little longer, listening to the quiet, letting the air slowly settle around me. It felt strange to realize that I had spent so many years trying to hold everything together, trying to make sure he never felt the kind of pain I had known, and now here I was standing alone, feeling the sharp edges of the pain he had given me. But even as my chest ached, there was a steadiness growing inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't loud, it wasn't rushing, it was quiet and clear, like the way the air feels right before the rain starts to fall. I knew that this moment was different, that this time I wasn't going to let things pass as if nothing had happened. I had swallowed enough hurt for one lifetime. I walked away from the window and sat down at the old wooden table, the one I had bought years ago when I first moved into this house. My hands rested flat on its surface, and I felt the grooves in the wood beneath my fingertips. This table had held so many of our meals, our conversations, and little moments I thought would last forever. I thought of the nights when he sat across from me laughing, the mornings when he rushed out the door as I called after him with a smile, and the quiet evenings when I prayed he would have the kind of life that didn't know hardship the way I did. All of those memories used to bring me comfort, but now they felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's life. As I sat there, I realized something simple but powerful. I had spent years holding on to him out of love, but I never once held on to myself with that same strength. I gave everything I had without saving a single piece of it for me. And now, sitting there with a bruise on my face and a storm building in my chest, I knew I had a choice. I could keep pretending, keep covering the pain, keep letting him speak to me as if my worth was nothing. Or I could let this moment be the one where everything shifts. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to beg. All I needed to do was take back the pieces of myself I had given away too freely. I reached for the small phone I kept in the kitchen drawer, the one I used for calls that really mattered. My hands were steady as I held it, not trembling the way they used to when I felt small. I thought back to the woman who had once told me that if I ever needed anything, she would be there. She wasn't just anyone. She was his boss's mother, a woman with a sharp mind and a soft heart, someone who had once told me that people reveal who they are not with their words, but with the way they treat the ones who love them the most. I had her number saved for years, not because I ever imagined needing it, but because a part of me trusted her. I scrolled through the contacts until I saw her name and pressed the call button. My heart didn't race. My voice didn't shake. I simply told the truth. I told her what had happened the night before, how he had looked me in the eye without a flicker of shame, how he had ordered me to cover my bruise and smile like my pain was nothing but an inconvenience. I didn't cry when I spoke. I didn't ask her for help. I just shared the truth for what it was. And she listened. Every word. There was a quiet on the other end of the line that felt heavy, not because it was empty, but because it carried understanding. She asked me gently if I was safe, and I told her yes. Then she asked me to send her a photo of the bruise, and I did without hesitation. When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not joy, not relief, but strength. A strength that didn't come from him or from anyone else, but from the simple act of standing up for myself quietly. I didn't know exactly how things would unfold, but for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of my pain shifting off my shoulders. I looked at my reflection in the small glass window and whispered softly to myself, "This time is different." And it was. This time I wasn't covering my bruise to hide it. I was letting the truth find its way out, piece by piece, until it no longer belonged to just me. After I ended that call, I just sat still for a long moment, letting everything around me grow quiet. It was a silence that didn't feel empty. It felt steady, almost like the air itself understood that something important had just happened. I didn't cry, I didn't shake, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel small. I knew the weight of what I carried was no longer sitting only on my shoulders, and that thought gave me a kind of strength I hadn't felt in years. It was the kind of strength that doesn't shout or fight, it just stands firm. I slowly looked around the house, taking in the walls that had heard everything I had ever said or kept hidden, and for the first time, I didn't feel trapped by them. I felt like someone who had taken the first quiet step toward freedom. The rest of the day moved slowly, almost like time itself was giving me space to breathe. I spent most of it alone in the house, moving from one room to the next, not rushing, just letting my thoughts stretch. I looked at the living room, the same one where I once sat with him while he told me stories about his day. I could still see his smile from those days, the one that used to fill me with hope. But now that memory sat heavy in the air, like something too fragile to touch. In the kitchen, I looked at the soup pot that had started everything, and I didn't see a meal anymore. I saw a line that had been crossed and could never be erased. The bruise on my face was still tender, but it wasn't the center of everything anymore. The real wound had lived deeper, in places only a mother's heart could feel, and it was finally starting to heal in its own quiet way. As the afternoon light shifted, I began to prepare for the evening without rushing. I did everything slowly, deliberately, almost as if I was reclaiming the house with every small step. I set the plates on the table, not out of duty, but because it reminded me that my hands were steady. I made the tea I liked, not the way he preferred it, and I drank it slowly, letting the warmth touch a part of me that had grown cold. It wasn't about pretending nothing had happened. It was about reminding myself that this was still my home, and my existence here was not built on anyone else's permission. When the evening came and I heard the sound of the car pulling up outside, I didn't feel the usual knot in my stomach. I felt calm. The door opened, his voice filled the space with the same sharpness it always carried, and then came the sound of laughter that belonged to his wife. They talked about the guests they were expecting that night, about how everything needed to be perfect, about appearances and impressions. I stood at the kitchen counter, listening to every word without showing a single flicker of the storm inside me. They had no idea that something bigger than them was already moving quietly beyond these walls. I took a long breath and felt the stillness settle deeper. They saw me standing there and thought I was the same woman they had spoken to that morning, the same one he could command without consequence. They didn't see the call I had made, the truth I had shared, or the calm resolve sitting in my chest. I said nothing, and yet that silence held more power than any argument could. I had lived long enough to learn that not every fight needed shouting. Sometimes the loudest stand is made when you simply stop allowing someone to treat your pain like it belongs to them. As the night drew closer, I straightened my shoulders, and I felt my breath grow steady and strong. He had no idea what was already waiting for him far away from this house, and I wasn't going to warn him. I wasn't going to defend myself anymore. I had chosen my side, and for the first time in years, it was mine. That silence he had always relied on to control me was about to become the very thing that would shake the ground beneath his feet. When the guests began to arrive that evening, their laughter floated through the air like a breeze that didn't belong to me. I stood quietly near the edge of the room, not out of fear, but because I wanted to see everything clearly. I watched them walk in with wide smiles and bright voices, talking about work and plans, about nothing that had any weight, and I wondered how many faces in this world hide storms behind polite smiles. The house, once filled with warmth and family, felt like a stage built for appearances. He stood there with his arm around his wife, smiling, talking, pretending like nothing had happened, like the bruise on my face didn't exist beneath the thin layer of cream covering it. He didn't look at me with regret. He looked at me like I was part of the furniture, something to be moved or arranged, not someone with a voice or a history. I moved around the room slowly, serving drinks and setting things down, not because I wanted to please him, but because I needed to see the truth up close. There's something powerful about silence when it's chosen, and I felt it growing stronger with each passing minute. I saw the way he straightened his posture when his boss's friend stepped in, how carefully he spoke, how his words turned softer, more polished. To everyone in that room, he was the perfect host, the well-spoken man with a stable life and a neat home. But they didn't see the storm he carried inside, the cruelty that hid behind that polished voice. I stood in the middle of it all and felt a strange kind of calm because I knew something he didn't. I knew that the image he was protecting so carefully was already cracking, and he hadn't even heard the sound yet. As the guests chatted, one woman walked a little closer to me. She had kind eyes, the kind that notice what others pretend not to see. Her gaze lingered on my cheek, not long enough to draw attention, but just enough to tell me she saw what I was hiding. She didn't ask questions. She didn't have to. Sometimes a quiet glance can speak louder than any words. She simply held my eyes for a second, and in that second I felt something warm settle inside me. It wasn't pity, it was understanding. The kind of understanding that tells you that even in a room full of people who don't care, someone sees you. That single moment made me stand a little straighter. I watched him laugh loudly at something his wife said, his voice carrying through the room with ease. He had no idea what was waiting for him outside the safety of this house. He had no idea that the woman standing in the corner of the room, the one he thought he had broken down into silence, had already placed the truth into hands that had power to make his voice tremble. I looked at him, not with anger, but with the kind of stillness that comes from knowing your strength isn't in shouting, it's in being unshakable. The longer the night went on, the more obvious it became how much he loved the sound of people admiring him. Every word he spoke was measured, careful, like a man who had built a wall of lies and was determined to keep it standing. But walls like that don't last forever. They always crack when the truth finds its way in, and mine had already begun that journey. He glanced at me a few times, expecting me to lower my head like I always used to, but I didn't. I met his eyes, steady, calm, not as the woman who had been slapped, but as the woman who had already decided she would never let that moment define the rest of her life. As I stood in that room, listening to the chatter, feeling the weight of his act unfold, I knew something he didn't. I knew this was the last time he would ever look at me as if my silence belonged to him. Soon, he would learn that the quietest people are often the ones who hold the heaviest truths, and when those truths finally find their way into the world, no amount of pretending can protect the one who caused the pain. I didn't need to fight him. I just needed to let time do what time always does. It exposes everything. When the last of the guests finally left and the door closed behind them, the house grew still again. The kind of stillness that makes every sound louder than it should be. I stood in the hallway for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me, feeling it press against my chest. He walked past me without a word, still carrying himself like nothing had changed, like the night had been just another performance where everything went his way. But what he didn't realize was that while he was busy playing the part of the good man, the truth had already started moving in places he couldn't see. I moved slowly through the room, clearing the plates from the table, not as someone serving, but as someone preparing to leave behind everything that no longer felt like home. My heart was calm, in a way it hadn't been in a long time. I no longer felt the need to defend myself or beg for what should have been freely given. The bruise on my face might have faded in days, but the memory of that moment would never fade, and neither would the strength that had grown out of it. As I placed the last glass on the counter, I caught my reflection in the window, and for the first time, I didn't see a woman waiting to be saved. I saw a woman who had saved herself quietly. I knew what I had done earlier was already changing the shape of everything. And while he believed he still held control over the story, the truth was no longer in his hands. The world outside these walls was already carrying my voice forward, even though I hadn't raised it. That thought wrapped around me like a steady warmth, and I knew there was no turning back. The next morning arrived slowly, and with it came a different kind of quiet. Not the heavy one that pressed down on me, but a stillness that felt like it was holding its breath. I knew that while this house looked the same, something beyond it had already shifted. He got dressed in his work clothes like he always did, moving through the house with the same careless confidence, completely unaware that the ground beneath him was already changing. He looked at me once, expecting the same lowered eyes, the same quiet obedience, but I met his stare with calmness. There was no fear in me, just a steady strength he didn't recognize anymore. He walked out the door without a second thought, carrying himself like someone who believed the world would never hold him accountable. But as I stood there watching him leave, I thought about the conversation I had the day before, about the truth that was already resting in the hands of someone who wouldn't turn away. I could almost see the way that truth would walk into that office before he even did. He thought my silence had made me weak, but what he never understood was that silence can move in ways louder than a shout ever could. I turned away from the door and sat down with my hands wrapped around my warm cup of tea, letting that quiet strength sink deeper into me. He didn't know that before this day ended, everything he built on lies and cruelty would begin to crack, not because I raised my voice, but because I finally chose to protect my worth. I didn't need to follow him or explain anything. Life had already started unfolding the truth on its own. As the hours slowly passed, I sat in that quiet house letting the day stretch out before me. Not in fear, but in a calm I hadn't felt in so long. I didn't pace the floor. I didn't worry about what was happening out there. Because deep down I already knew the truth had reached where it needed to go. I could almost picture the look on his face when everything he tried so hard to hide finally stood right in front of him. I imagined the stillness in that office, the weight of that photo, and the silence that would follow when he realized this time there was no pretending it away. When he came back that evening, the air around him felt different. His footsteps were slower, heavier, like a man who had met something he couldn't control. He didn't speak when he saw me, and for the first time there was no command in his voice, no sharp words waiting to cut through the air. He just stood there, lost for words, and I didn't offer him any. I stayed where I was, steady, quiet, and unshaken. The same silence he had once used to make me feel small now belonged to me. And in that silence, I felt something settle in my chest like a steady flame. He could no longer pretend that what he did had no weight. He could no longer hide behind his polished smile. The world he built on the idea that I would always stay quiet had finally met the truth, and nothing would ever be the same again. That night, as the house sank into silence, I sat by the small lamp near the window and let my mind travel through everything that had happened. I thought about how one moment, one slap, one cruel order could uncover the truth of everything that had been hidden beneath years of giving, trusting, and believing. I had spent so much time thinking that silence was something that kept me safe, but now I understood it had power only when it belonged to me. This time, I hadn't used it to hide. I had used it to protect myself and let the truth speak where my voice once trembled. I looked around the room and realized that my heart no longer ached the same way it did that first night. The pain was still there, yes, but it no longer felt like it was pulling me under. It had turned into something else, something that stood beside me instead of against me. I had faced the kind of betrayal that reaches into the quiet corners of a person's soul, and I had come out of it standing taller than I expected. The woman who once sat in this house afraid to be heard was gone, and in her place was someone who had learned to let strength rise softly. I whispered to myself that I deserved a life where respect wasn't a favor but a given. I deserved to be seen, to be treated like I mattered, not because of what I gave, but because of who I was. I knew then that whatever came next, I wouldn't walk backward. I had carried enough hurt. Now it was time to carry myself. As I sat there, I felt a calmness settle over me, like a soft blanket, the kind that doesn't hide the hurt but reminds you that you survived it. I wasn't the same woman who had stood in that kitchen with tears in her eyes. I was someone who had found her strength without raising her voice, someone who had chosen herself after years of being overlooked. What happened that night would always be a part of my story, but it would never be the ending. It would be the moment everything changed, the moment I learned that silence can carry power when it stands with dignity. I had taken back what was mine, piece by piece. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of my story. If this touched your heart, I'd love for you to tell me where you're watching from in the comments, share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe so we can walk through more stories together.